Take a seat. I'm sure you want to talk to the previous panelists. It was a great conversation, but we also have another four amazing people. I mean, I can't see anybody, but could everybody please settle down, take a seat? People on the first panel, thank you very much. Don't want to take names. Hello, can everybody hear me? Okay. I'm Iman. I recently graduated from college, from Yale, in December of 2023. So I'm pretty young, so I'm hoping that will, knowing that fact will help you sort of forgive me if I make mistakes while I moderate this panel. I'm an associate editor at SAAG, and I'll be moderating a panel on form and resistance. I want to begin actually with the sort of claim that was made in panel 1 of the failure of language, and hope that this panel can maybe offer people in sort of response to that failure some form of hope to latch onto. I really want to start with Saidiya Hartman, also speaking about the failure of language in Venus in Two Acts. She writes, "How does one recuperate lives with and impossible to differentiate from the terrible utterances that condemned them to death, the account books that identified them as units of value, the invoices that claimed them as property, and the banal chronicles that stripped them of human features? Can the shock of such words, as Foucault writes, give rise to a certain effect of beauty mixed with dread? Can we, as Philippe suggests, conjure something new from the absence of Africans as humans that is at the heart of the text? And if so, what are the lineaments of this new narrative? Put differently, how does one rewrite the chronicle of a death foretold and anticipated, as collective biography of dead subjects, as counter-history of the human, as a practice of freedom?" And I really want to emphasize that I believe that all four of our panelists are finding ways and forms to do exactly that, to give voice to the voiceless, to say things that are often unsaid, to make the everyday banality of lived experience from Gaza to Kashmir to the United States to where I'm from in Pakistan, something that can be a shared experience to learn from and speak to. So I'm just going to start with introducing each one of our panelists and then dive into the questions. Starting with Suneil. Suneil is an artist, researcher, and filmmaker, spanning experimental video and film, animations, essays, and installations. His work contends with questions of identity, heritage, culture, and diaspora in relation to structural violence and anti-colonial struggles across the global South. Sanzgiri's films offer sonic and visual journeys through family history, local mythology, and colonial legacies of extraction in Goa, India, where his family originates, deftly utilizing and vividly blending together 3D renderings, drone videography, photogrammetry, LiDAR scaling, and a bunch of other complicated art terms. Sanzgiri's work has been screened extensively at festivals and venues around the world. He has won awards at numerous film festivals and has been named one of the 25 new faces of independent film in Filmmakers magazine's fall of 2021. He's currently working on his first feature-length work, focusing on the bonds of solidarity that developed out of resistance to the Portuguese Empire between India and Africa. Next, I'm going to introduce Maira, who's sitting right next to Suneil, is a multimedia producer, writer, organizer, and educator based in Chicago. The home base for Maira's work is as Director of Public Strategy at the Invisible Institute, an independent journalism production nonprofit on the south side of Chicago that works to enhance the capacity of citizens to address human rights and redress violations of constitutional rights. She is most proud of her 7-year ongoing commitment to the Youth Police Project, where she works with young people most affected by policing in the south side of Chicago to shape new discussions and efforts around public safety. Since 2020, she has organized with community group Not Me, We, which builds people power among poor and working class Black and brown folks on the south side of Chicago as well. Most recently, she has worked as an associate producer on We Grow Now, directed by Minhal Baig, a film about children in now demolished high-rise public housing in Chicago. Next is Kalpana Raina. Kalpana is actually a very interesting panelist, I would like to think so. They are a senior executive with extensive financial and management experience in the US, as well as internationally. They currently serve on the boards of Information Services Group, Words Without Borders, and the Advisory Board of Impact Investment Exchange. We have Kalpana on the panel because most recently she has translated a book from Kashmir from her own uncle, Hari Krishna Kaul. Her collaborative translation project of these stories, called For Now It Is Night, was published in winter 2023 by HarperCollins in India and spring 2024 by Archipelago Press in the United States. Last, Sharmin is a Bangladeshi queer Muslim organizer and artist from Queens, New York. She is the organizing director at 18 Million Rising, building national Asian American political power that contributes to movements for racial justice, abolition, anti-militarism, and democracy through political education and deep base building. Sharmin was the campaign director of Liberate Abortion, as well as previously a political director at Equality Labs. As the co-founder of a Bangladeshi feminist collective and graduate from SUNY Hunter College, Sharmin spends her time interior designing and nerding out about Muslim and South Asian liberation struggles. And for over 5 years, she's also been a lead facilitator and organizer for the East Coast Solidarity Summer. It's just an overall amazing group of panelists. So I really just want to start with maybe a simple question coming at the head of the previous panel, which is, when language fails us, what do we turn to? And in turning to various forms, be it filmmaking or multimedia journalism or translation, what are our panelists intending to do in picking that particular form? So yeah, let's start there. Hopefully I can figure out how to get this out. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and yeah, I think, so language has definitely failed us, but I do just want to back up and understand what specifically about language has failed. And for me, it is understanding that the level of human suffering in Gaza and the grotesque dehumanization defies words. It's not just that definitions aren't useful to us, it's just that we don't even have the capacity for expressing the level of suffering that we are witnessing. And by extension, images are also failing us. So I'm sorry. It's not just that language has failed us, images have failed us on a number of levels in understanding that, like, you know, the underlying premise of the images that people have risked their lives, journalists have risked their lives, and in many cases, their lives are no longer with us, to get these images to us, to our screens. The underlying premise is that somehow images can change the world, and that if we just see enough of the horrors coming out of Gaza, that we would change, and that something would change. And we know that that's not the case, because we are bombarded with these images on a daily basis. And so I guess the question then, if images and language both fail, what is there in the realm of the sort of productive capacity for expression? Because I think it's what your question is kind of coming down to, is this question of expression. How do we express ourselves when images and language no longer are able to convey the expressions that we're feeling? So I guess I don't really have an answer to that, other than understanding something I go to as a filmmaker, which is this idea of impressions, and sort of practices of non-enclosure. I often turn to the filmmaker and theorist and writer Trinh T. Minh Ha, Vietnamese writer who writes a lot about questions of speaking nearby, and this sort of poetics of practicing non-enclosure, not trying to sort of condense, or flatten, or describing something in ways that give it more power in some ways. So when we're trying to understand oppressive systems, sometimes just by naming it, we give it more power in various ways. And so sometimes when we're able to understand all of the things that operate around something, we're able to speak nearby in this sense. So I think that there's levels, there's questions of poetics, there's questions of practices of non-enclosure, practices of not defining something, because definitions are a colonial product, categories are colonial products, genres are colonial products. So the kind of in between is where we find things. At least those are things that I'm interested in, because I think the spaces in between areas can potentially have more resonance or find ways of expressing things that we didn't even know were possible. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Myra. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for starting us off with this question. I know many folks are excited to pause for iftar soon, so also just want to acknowledge that. So I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'm going to be succinct. I am actually really interested in clarity, and I'm really interested in shared definitions. And my background is in journalism, and when I've reached the shared theme of this of when language has failed us, or when we say that, actually, when I say that, I mean that realizing that there is no amount of information that you can give to a society that necessarily means that they will be compelled to act. And that is a really hard thing to grapple with in journalism, and so many journalists who cover human rights abuses. My focus is on police torture in Chicago. That when you get to that point of realizing you can continue down the hole of there is still so much to be known, and we really, even when we go beyond the surface, we are aware that we're really just knowing a fragment of what is knowable. And also, when does the journey of knowing not necessarily stop, but transform you into acting? And so when we say language has failed us or images have failed us, no, we failed us. And also, by aiming for clarity within language is so important to me, because I really appreciated the point on the panel made before us about, what we're actually interested in is material risk. And so people have a variety of definitions about solidarity, but what we do know is that what will bring about change, and I love the concept of interconnectedness, that's how I think about my work as well, is my solidarity only matters so much as it is actually risking something and bringing about a shift to capital. And so to that end, I think it's important to go through this exercise of making shared definitions or finding clarity in language, because it is useful to us, and because we know that violence is inscribed in words always before it's inscribed on bodies. We see that in our American cities around the way we debate gender and women and who's a woman, who's a man, and we see the impact that it has on the killing of trans people, right? And so we do know that language matters, that language has meaning. We do know that there is a difference, that U.S. prison systems, it's a very specific thing to be incarcerated in a prison, in a U.S. prison, right? So I do want to encourage us to when clarity can be found, to point at it and say no, it is a important act of solidarity to block an entrance to a weapons manufacturing building, right? That is an important act of solidarity, and it is risking capital. So thank you for this. And so to the point about this panel and form, I come from a background of journalism, and I find that helpful to think about human rights reporting as a form. And then to the point of world building and imagination, I turn to the form of storytelling in multimedia ways, and also just within an organizing construct of like imagining what we are working towards in a hyper-local context of Chicago. So thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me here, and I do acknowledge feeling a little bit of a misfit, not only because Iman said she was one of the youngest people here, and probably one of the oldest people here, but also having a very varied experience. My beginnings were in literature, so I just want to establish those bona fides before I switch to management. And this translation, this work of translation, which is very recent, it's my first work of translation, is kind of like coming back full circle to where I started. So again, a few facts to establish. I am a Kashmiri. I'm a Kashmiri Hindu. And the writer I translated is also a Kashmiri Hindu. But my collaborators in this translation project are Kashmiri Muslims. They are younger than I am. We're men and women. And how did this all start? This was a personal project for me. The writer is my uncle, or was my uncle. He died in 2009. And he was a part of the 1989-1990 exodus of Kashmiri Hindus from Kashmir, the forced migration. And that's not why I picked up this project. I picked up this project because he is an extremely good writer, an extremely good storyteller, who writes about Kashmir and Kashmiris in the context of being human beings. He talks about what binds the Muslims and the Hindus together. He talks about what divides them. But yes, after 89 and 90, he started talking more about what it meant to lose his homeland, and for a writer, what it meant to lose his audience and his language, because living outside of Kashmir in Delhi, he lost his audience overnight. And those, again, become parts of this whole conversation that we're having today of interconnectedness, solidarity, and in this case, displacement. And I'll just talk a little bit about, I can talk more about the project, but what drew me to finding young Kashmiri Muslims to work with me on this was I'm an American citizen and have been living in this country for 40 plus years now. I had become very remote from Kashmir. I had become very alien to Kashmir. And when I started to think about this, the last 5 years brought me much closer to Kashmir, and it became quite obvious to me. The writer writes in Nastaliq, which is the Persian Arabic script, which very few Kashmiri Hindus any longer can read or write, including myself. I cannot read or write that script. So it became very obvious to me, if these stories had to be disseminated and told around the world, I needed to find people who could read that script. And that by force, now it just means young Kashmiri Muslims. And I deliberately went to Srinagar to find collaborators, because having been away from Kashmir for so many years, I decided in my own way, this was a small personal attempt to get a dialogue going, to understand what was happening in Kashmir for young people who lived there. And it was very interesting through this project, there's not enough time to talk about it, how we came to understand a little bit about each other, their problems. And I don't mean to speak for all Kashmiris or Kashmiri Hindus, but it was very interesting for me when I realized that for 2 of the 3 of them, I was the first Kashmiri Hindu they had interacted with since 89, 90. So I'll just stop there and pick it up later.
So we are going to break for iftar, which is right now. So we have food set up on the table to my left, your right. So we're just going to take about 5 minutes or so, if people could grab food and then return to their chairs, and then we'll come back and continue with the panel. Yeah, so just 5 minutes or so, and yeah. Okay, so we're gonna get started again. Hopefully people will settle down as we get into the questions. I do want to take something one more time from panel one, particularly Hiba's sort of exclamation of being a sociologist and working directly with people and sort of letting them sort of talking about how the history of ideas is the history of ideas only insofar as those ideas are interpreted and used and lived and experienced by people in their everyday lives, and that's what sociologists do. But I like to think that our panelists in sort of making film, in doing journalism, reportage work, in organizing directly with people, and often sort of relenting to them to let them speak for themselves, do the work of sociology sort of with much more rigor, if not the same, as some of our panelists from the first discussion. And I want to open this question to each of you to sort of maybe talk about how speaking directly with people and doing the work of ethnography impacts the kind of decisions that you make about form. Like, how does maybe translation or film lend itself better in a way, perhaps, and they can talk about this, to the role of listening and talking to people and having them share their stories by themselves. Figure out how to take this out.
Well, I think Sharmin should start because you didn't get a chance.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Sharmin. I think the work of talking is not done enough. Pico, California did a study because they were a grassroots organization that was trying to assess why are we as a community so isolated, even though we're in one of the most populated counties in California. And they found that people speak to a fraction of the people that they used to 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, you maybe talked to 5 or 6 people a day. Now people are speaking to a quarter of that amount of people every day, if even, right? And that's if you work like an outward-facing job or if you have a daily life where you have to interact with humans. And I think New York is such an interesting example because none of us want to talk to each other out here. We're pissed, we're scared on the streets now. We know how isolating it could be to even have to speak because it's just, the world is asking too much of us. Capitalism is killing us, right? And so I think often about how we failed each other by not talking to each other enough, how scary it is to start that fight with that aunt, or how like nervous you are to tell that person what they did hurt your feelings. And I think a lot of work of organizing is actually chipping away at those structures of isolation that capitalism has done so well at to force us to be another person. Even if that person is like calling yourself a people pleaser, LOL, I would love to know how many people are pleased with you, A. B, there's this like narrative that we give too much, we do too much. You know what, y'all? A revolution is gonna require you to do 10 times that work. And I listened to this TikTok, cause TikTok, good form, about to get banned, let's fight that. And this TikTok, this girl was like, let's bring back barter economy. Why am I calling an Uber to go to the airport? Why am I not calling that uncle who's my neighbor, who I know is a taxi driver, who could be my homie and drive me to the airport, and maybe I'll cook his pregnant wife dinner for a week in exchange, right? There are so many ways that we have isolated ourselves where we are not imagining ways that we could show up in exchange for things that make our lives better, to be honest. Like, if I garden for my neighbor and that person is an amazing community safety person that is always nosy as hell, they can make sure my packages aren't getting stolen, right? So there's all these ways that we as a society have kind of become antisocial and like isolationists, and we embody that, and we're gonna have to figure out new ways of being and organizing from the place where people are, right? The disaster-verse concept to me is bringing me back to the basics. When the world is ending, where are the places where I can go back to community building and learning the land, learning about flood systems, learning about community safety in a way that make both prisons and the police obsolete. And you know, it's hard, it's annoying, it gets under your skin, and it's also gonna be ridden with conflict. And I think I had to get better at conflict, because a huge form of language, a huge form of exchange, a huge form of power is at the root conflict, right? So I think a lot about that, and I've been thinking a lot about what parts of me I need to let go to be a new person for this iteration of the apocalypse, but also like the petty self that often tells me I shouldn't do that, has to quiet down in order for me to be different in my community and my friendships, right? So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
I'm hoping, Suneil, you can talk about maybe film, particularly like the work that you're doing on your most recent film. Sorry, I'm a little lost. Here the Earth Grows Gold. I was wondering how film and multimedia has given you the opportunity to bridge the gap between the sort of the personal storytelling and sort of the experience of the public or the political in writing about colonialism between Portuguese and India. And specifically, your film here, The Earth Grows Gold, sort of lets family members that directly experienced and resisted colonial narratives in Goa speak for themselves. So like, what is that experience of listening like, particularly in the category of film?
So the film, so the film's actually called, the exhibition is called Here the Earth Grows Gold. The film is called Two Refusals, or that's the kind of project name. Yeah, but it's a kind of hybrid work that part of it was a collaboration with the poet, the Hyderabadi Muslim poet Shami Ali Naeem, who's based out of Philadelphia, an amazing poet. You should all check out her work. And so we worked together on this script that was kind of thinking through this intergenerational memory of women that kind of gets passed down between a daughter and a mother. And the kind of main character of the film, her dreams are sort of haunted by this figure from Portuguese mythology called the Adamastor, which was this storm cloud that formed on the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, where it sort of tried to destroy Vasco da Gama's ship and prevent him from ever reaching India by way of Africa. And this was in Os Lusíadas, which was written in like 1500s, right? So we kind of thought of this storm cloud, this tempest, as a way to think through these questions of possibility of what could have been. And someone had mentioned in the previous panel this idea of possibility. So a large portion of my work is thinking through the histories of Afro-Asianism, kind of in the wake of the Bandung Conference, which, for those who don't know, was a sort of meeting of anti-colonial leaders and struggles, roughly, sort of between the Asian and African continents, and tried to chart a new way forward outside of, kind of hegemonies of U.S. and Soviet Union, and what would become the non-aligned movement. They tried to create a world that would prevent from colonialism and imperialism from ever happening again. Of course, that world did not come to pass, but the kind of quote-unquote spirit of Bandung was this kind of articulation of this moment of possibility of like what that moment actually could have ushered. That moment was indeed a very spectacular failure on a number of levels, but these kind of desires continued. There were many different kind of meeting points between African and Asian solidarity, quote-unquote solidarity spaces, which is really just to understand, how can we understand our struggle in relationship to your struggle? How can our struggle benefit your struggle? And many people don't know this, but we actually in Goa owe our liberation to the African leaders like Amilcar Cabral and many others who actually pressured Nehru to intervene in Goa. Nehru never would have intervened in Goa if it hadn't been for the pressure of African liberation leaders from around the continent who said, if you can intervene and overthrow the Portuguese in Goa, then our movements will be even more successful because of that. So they campaigned and pressured him to do it in India. And so very much us Goans owe our liberation to, African liberation struggles. And that doesn't get acknowledged a lot. So this film kind of looks to these quote unquote minor histories, histories of figures that have sort of slipped through, popular narrative. Specifically, it's looking at this woman named Sita Valej, who was of Goan origin and who went to go fight in the Angolan liberation struggle. And she was a fierce revolutionary. She was a doctor. She was taking care of people in the countryside. And unfortunately, the tragedy is that she was disappeared by the government that she helped to establish, the MPLA, who are still in power. And so the film is also kind of looking at this kind of aftermath of decolonization and this sort of dark period, very much invoking, the Hindutva kind of turn as well and asking that question of what could have been, right? And so a lot of it's told through a combination of poetic kind of reflection, various forms of images that kind of flash in various moments on screen. And then there's a lot of interviews. There's, and it brings to this question of like witnessing, which I think is at the core of what your question is, what it means to witness, what it means to tell a story. There's a Goan liberation fighter. Her name is Sharda Swaikar. She was 17 years old when she was brutally imprisoned by the Portuguese. And she sang us these songs, she's 94 years old now. And she sang us these songs when we were interviewing her that, she wrote on like little scraps of paper when she was in prison. But it's just, she sang them as if it was that moment. It was as if she was like 17 years old. And something she says in her interview is, I had to survive because you needed to hear this. You needed me. She says, we had to live to tell these tales. And so I think that, the question of witnessing is, it's an open question, I think. I think that we're all witnesses right now to this genocide. And it's a question that needs to be explored more, this question of witnessing. Shahid, the Arabic word for martyr, right, means to witness. So witnessing is an act of knowing that if you do not live to tell that tale, then that history might be erased, and that's just as necessary to continue. Yeah.
I think, Myra, maybe like the same question. I was looking at your work on the Invisible Institute, and you sort of talk about how at first, in sort of thinking about the hyper-policing of young black people in the south side of Chicago, you guys went in with the intention of doing civic education and working with them and sort of giving lessons on the law and civil liberties and how to sort of negotiate those ideas, but then eventually turned towards listening and sort of having to learn from them directly in terms of the stories of hyper-policing from black youth. And I'm just wondering what that turn meant in terms of your work, but also when sometimes listening and sort of direct reportage from an experience like fails to yield the kind of results that we want. I think in the last panel, Suchitra talked about the failure of like the conversation of abolition when it transfers from the US to India, it sort of fragments and fails to uphold in the same way. So I'm just wondering when that form lends itself well to your work and maybe when it doesn't.
Thank you so much for that question. So some context. So I was lucky enough to walk into this project, to walk into the Invisible Institute when the turn had already happened. So the Youth Police Project essentially is an extended act of listening. It's a listening project that is based on the south side of Chicago. It ran for more than 10 years, since 2011. And a combination of sociologists, journalists, law students, civil rights attorneys, photographers, would every week go into a junior and senior, like 16 through 18 years old classroom on the south side of Chicago. The school is like 99% black and all low income. And the point of the project was to understand from teenagers' perspectives what the mundane daily encounter with police look like. So there's police in the school, but also just, this was the era of like stop and frisk was like really rampant in New York, and Chicago at the time was denying that it even existed. And we learned from the students then that it was really common. We were also a part of the strategy of like both reporting on it, but then also the attorneys that we collaborated with were a big part of pushing for reforms to stop pedestrian stops. And then what we learned from the students long before it showed up in the data of academic papers was that as stop and frisk reduced, traffic stops went up. And so we would learn from our young people long before the experts credentialed by universities would acknowledge something. And so to this point of our listening practice, I think the most important thing about that form of engagement with young people and just with people in general is that people are not used to necessarily not just feeling heard in the context of one interview, but in the course of developing a relationship over at least a 2-year commitment. A lot of those young people are now like 25, 26, and we still know many of them. And what we've learned is that when you walk into a classroom and you ask young people like, oh, who's had an encounter with police before? That means encounter means different things. Some people think it means something extremely like violent of being beat up, right? And people also trust needs to be built in order to actually have a conversation where someone shares their true feelings and encounters with you. And so we would learn things from young people a year plus into knowing them. Now to the point of taking a lot of those lessons that we learn from young people, being able to then use it as a form of accountability, not just for our journalism, but also for the attorneys who are working on their legal strategies. The young people basically inform the priorities. I think what has been really tough to see is in Chicago, it's now been many years, it's been at least 6 years since the Department of Justice, the US Department of Justice, investigated the Chicago Police Department. And then there was a consent decree, which basically means there's a long list of reforms the police have to do. And so it's been a few years since that's been implemented, and the police have implemented 6% of the list of 300 plus reforms. And that lack of accountability is really hard because it's okay, what's the hammer here? Where is the power? We can talk a lot about it. And now this is coming back to this point about base building and organizing. Now it means that we have to take the act of listening and put it into the context of one-on-one conversations of figuring out okay, what are people able to do? What do they want to do? What's in their self-interest? And so all this to say is it is really hard when even when stories are told, even when reforms are implemented through the existing legal systems, you still have enough listening projects that exist, and still it's okay, we have to systemically change the way the police department works. And this is my example of Chicago police. And then the last quick thing I'll say about listening is I think a cool thing about listening can also be, in addition to the vulnerability, in addition to getting over your conflict avoidance and people pleasing, et cetera, is that listening can also be a form of accompaniment. And by that I mean when somebody who you are interconnected with is navigating a very tough thing, navigating a government system that is a very oppressive in very minute ways that you only know through very carefully listening, actually accompanying someone through the process and not just saying wow, that sounds really hard, but instead hey, okay, I'm gonna help you fill out this application. We're gonna walk to this office together and file this complaint together. And that is a form of listening too. So that's what I would offer.
And then maybe lastly, the same question to Kalpana. Particularly, you spoke about how you actually didn't read the Nastaliq script and sort of all of the stories that were written in the Nastaliq script, despite the fact that you speak Kashmiri, were first recorded, and that you and your translator sort of worked in collaboration, literally listening to the recording of those stories. So I'm just wondering, how does, there's the literal configuration of the listening to the stories, but how does sort of that act of doing the listening together inform the project that is For Now It Is Night?
Thank you. That's actually a very good question, because just again, back up on this project, I actively looked for young people to help me with this, because I wanted to, there had been some translations done of Kaul before, but the translations, in my opinion, were sort of archaic and kind of Victorian too. And I was looking for some fresh contemporary voices to help me with this. And of course, the first stumbling block was that even though I speak Kashmiri fluently, I don't read or write it, as Iman pointed out, because I don't know the script. And Kaul, since he had left Kashmir or been actually forced out of Kashmir, his work was no longer in print. So it was very hard to locate the 4 collections of short stories, and my colleagues, my collaborators, found them. They were not in very good shape because they were in the lithographic offset print, and they were literally bleeding from atmospheric damage, from the damage of the 2014 floods, and sort of reconstructing those and then recording the stories for me so that I could listen to the stories and start working with them on these translations. But the work, the actual translation project actually started in the summer of 2019. And we kind of apportioned stories to each other, you take 2, I'll take 2, you take 3, and so on. As we dispersed to work on our stories, this was August of 2019, and Article 370 was abrogated. So 2 of my collaborators were in Srinagar, and they were cut off from the world for a couple of months. They had minimal internet access, and it was very difficult to communicate. We managed to work our way through that, and we got together again. And I'm laughing, I'm sure you'll understand why. We got together in March of 2020, again, the 4 of us, and we sat down to work on, we saw each other's drafts, we sat down to see what we had done. And we dispersed again, and COVID hit, and the pandemic happened, and we found ourselves in 4 different places. So most of this book was completed during the pandemic years over Zoom. Every weekend, we met Saturdays and Sundays for 2-3 hours from Srinagar, from Bangalore. I was back in New York, and we worked on these stories, and we went back to the basics. We read the stories line by line, we listened to them line by line, and we realized that in that process of collectively reading and listening, a whole new interpretation, a whole new direction was coming to these stories. And while we were listening to these stories in an effort to translate them, because we were so cut off from the rest of the world, we were telling our stories to each other. I heard about the father of one of my collaborators who had been fastened to one of the army trucks so that any pellets or any stones that were being thrown would be hitting this old man first before they got to the army. I heard about one of my other collaborators who had actually been shot by the army, and I'm laughing again because his retelling of the story is amazing. During his stay in hospital, he decided he was better off being an academic than fighting the Indian army in Kashmir. And he ended up by doing some very, very good work on Kashmir. And they, in turn, heard from me the story of this writer who literally came home. He was a college professor, and he came home one night to find a notice on his door saying if he and his family didn't leave Srinagar that same night, they would all be killed. And he did. He left with his family and with my aging grandfather. And in their hurry to leave, he left all his manuscripts behind. His plays, his poetry, his criticism, his novels, his short stories were all left behind. And all of this came out in this process of translating these 18 stories. And it's my hope, and maybe it's naive, maybe it's as a result of seeing what can be done at an individual level. It's my hope that this is the first writer, Kashmiri modern writer, to be published in the US. And it's my hope that this will provide a template to other people from other parts of the world to work collaboratively together to bring all these amazing stories back to each one of us.
There's like so many questions I can ask, but we are short on time. So I'm just gonna open to the audience for questions. If it's similar to the first panel and there aren't none, that's fine too. Is there a question? Okay, I do encourage everybody to please check out everyone's work. Sharmin's doing amazing work with 18 Million Rising, and organizations always need more people involved, so get involved. Similarly, Myra's doing amazing organizing work in the south side of Chicago, that if somebody's from Chicago, please get involved. And do check out, For Now It Is Night, we have some copies on the merch table at the front, and Suneil's film, which hopefully will be out soon.
Well, I have an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum right now. That's that's up until May. Yeah, so you can see the film at the Brooklyn Museum. It's open until May. Yeah.
Thank you everybody.